Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We continue with The Hardy Boys Hunting for Hidden Gold. Chapter 18, The Blizzard. The Hardy Boys set off down the trail at a good pace. The wind howled down from the crags and whistled through the trees. The entire mountain was veiled in a great mist of swirling snow, and as the wind rose, the snow stung their faces and slashed against them. "Storm coming up," said Frank, burying his chin deeper into his coat collar. "I hope it doesn't get any worse. We'll never find the place. We won't give up now. If we wait until tomorrow, it may be too late." The storm grew rapidly worse. The snowfall was so heavy that it obscured even the tops of the great masses of rock, and it quickly drifted over the trail so that the boys were forced to follow the path by memory. This was difficult, as in some places the trail had wound about through tumbled masses of boulders, and when it was hidden by the snow, they had to guess at its inaccurate windings. Several times Frank lost it altogether, but he was always able to pick up the trail again in some place that was sheltered from the storm. The boys struggled on in silence. The wind was increasing in volume, and the snow was so heavy that Joe could scarcely see the dim form of his brother but a few yards ahead. Suddenly he saw his brother stop. "I've lost the trail," shouted Frank, turning back. They were standing ankle-deep in snow. There was not the slightest vestige of a path. High above them they could discern the gloomy mass of a steep rock cliff. And before them loomed a sloping declivity of rock that afforded not the slightest foothold. "I lost the trail farther back, but I thought I was following all right and could pick it up further on. We'll have to turn back." They retraced their steps. So furiously was it snowing that their own footprints were almost obliterated, and they could scarcely find their way back to the place where they had left the trail. They found it again, however, and struck out in another direction. It was growing bitterly cold, and although they were warmly clad, they began to feel the effect of the chill wind that swept down from the icy mountain slopes. They pulled their caps down over their ears and made their way slowly forward against the terrific wind that buffeted them and flung sheets of snow against them. Frank gave a shout of triumph when he finally picked up the trail again in the shelter of some huge rocks where the snow had not yet penetrated. They advanced with new courage. At length they emerged through the defile where the trail to the outlaws' deserted camp led off the main trail up the mountain, and then they rested. Far below, they could see the slope of the mountain, veiled in sweeping banners of snow that shifted and swirled madly in the blustering wind. The town was hidden from view and obscured by the white blizzard. "Do you think we should try to make it?" asked Frank. "The mine?" "Yes. You're leading this procession. Whatever you want to do. If you think the storm is too bad, we'll start for the cabin. What would you rather do?" "I hate to give up now," replied Frank, after a moment of hesitation. "I feel the same way about it," Joe said. "I vote we try to find the mine. Once we get there, we'll be able to get in out of the storm anyway." "I thought you'd say that," laughed Frank. "We'll head for the Lone Tree Mine then. As far as I can remember, it's just below us, and then over to the right. We'll find it, I guess." They started down the slope, but once they left the shelter of the rocks where they had rested, they found that the fury of the storm was increased twofold on the mountainside. The full force of the blizzard struck them. The wind shrieked with 1,000 voices. The snow came sweeping down on them as though lashed by invisible whips. The roar of the storm sounded in their ears, and the fine snow almost blinded them. "It's worse than I thought," muttered Frank. The slope was steep and precipitous. They could not distinguish the details of the trail, other than as a vaguely winding path that led steadily downward. Frank lost his footing on the slippery rock and went tumbling down the declivity for several yards before he came to a stop in a snowbank. He got to his feet slowly and limped on, suffering from a bruised ankle. The trail wound about a steep cliff, and he skirted the base of it, then disappeared between two high masses of rock. Joe could dimly see the figure of his brother, and he hastened on so as not to lose sight of him. But when Joe came round the rocks, he was confronted by an opaque cloud of snow, like a huge white screen that had dropped from the sky. He could not see Frank at all. He followed the trail as well as he could, but in a few moments he came to a stop. He was out in the open mountainside, and the winds at this point converged so that the snow seemed to be swirling about him from all sides. The faint trail had been wholly obliterated. He shouted, "Frank! Frank!" But the wind flung the words back into his teeth. A feeling of panic seized him for a moment, but he quickly calmed down, for he realized that when Frank looked behind and saw they were separated, he would retrace his steps. He went on uncertainly a few paces until it occurred to him that he might be wandering in the wrong direction, and that if Frank did turn back, he might not be able to find him. So he tried to return to the trail again, but the snow was falling so heavily by now that he seemed to be wandering in an enormous gray void from which all directions had been erased. He was helplessly lost, so he stood where he was and shouted again and again. There was no answer. He could only hear the constant howling of the wind, the sweep and swish of snow. Once he thought he heard a faint cry from far ahead, but he could not be sure, and although he listened intensely, he could hear it no more. As he stood there on the rocks, with the snow sweeping down on him, with the wind howling about him, with all the gaunt, gloomy shapes of the boulders looming out the heavy mist of storm, Joe felt the icy clutch of the cold, and he began to beat his arms against his chest so as to keep warm. He knew the danger of inaction in such a blizzard. Anything was better than remaining where he was. He struggled forward, slipped and fell on the rocks, regained his feet, and moved slowly on into the teeth of the wind. He did not know whether he was following the trail or not, but to the best of his judgment he tried to descend the slope. As for Frank, he had been plunged doggedly on through the storm, confident that Joe was close behind, and it was not until he had gone far down the trail that he became aware that his brother was not following. He turned, and when he could no longer discern the figure in the storm behind, he retraced his steps, shouting at the top of his lungs. There was no answer. He reached about, going to the left and the right of the trail. He did not dare go far, being fearful of losing the trail himself. Frank was alarmed lest Joe had slipped and fallen on the rocks and injured himself. If he was unable to proceed, he would freeze to death, laying helpless on the mountainside. With this thought in his mind, he reached frantically. He tried to follow back up the trail, but the snow had swept over his footsteps, and he soon found himself knee-deep in heavy drifts, and he knew he had lost the path. He tried to regain the trail, but the white screen of snow was like a shroud over the rocks, and he had lost all sense of direction. He floundered about in the snow aimlessly, but the trail constantly evaded him. Frank set his jaw grimly and went higher and higher, stopping every little while to shout. He knew that the wind drowned out his voice, and he realized the frailty of his cries. But still he hoped there was just a chance that Joe might hear him. Frank Hardy felt an overpowering sense of loneliness as he wandered about among the rocks and the deep drifts. He seemed to be alone in the world of swirling, shrieking winds and flailing snow that stormed down from a sky of leaden hue. He shouted again and again, but to no avail. It was mid-afternoon, but the sky was so dark that it seemed almost dusk. If darkness fell and they were lost out on the mountainside, there was little hope that they would survive until morning. They would perish from exposure. "I'd better go back to Hank Shale's place, get a search party, and come up and look for Joe," he thought. This seemed the only sensible solution. But when he turned and tried to find the trail down the mountain again, he found that it had eluded him. There was not the vestige of a trail, not the sign of a path. "And now I'm lost too," he muttered. The wind shrieked down from the rocks. The snow swirled furiously about him. The blizzard raged. The roaring of the storm drummed in his ears as he stumbled and floundered about among the rocks and the snow. The Hardy Boys were lost, separated in the storm. Chapter 19. The Lone Tree. Suddenly, Frank Hardy had an inspiration. In the shelter of some rocks, he cleared away the snow, then began to search about for wood in order to build a fire. If he were lost, the best plan was to build a fire which would serve the double purpose of keeping him warm and possibly guiding Frank towards him as well. He found some small shrubs and stunted trees and managed to break off enough branches to serve as a basis of a fair-sized blaze. He had matches in a waterproof box in his pocket, and after several unsuccessful attempts, he finally managed to get a fire going. The wood was damp, but the small twigs caught the blaze, and within a few minutes the flames were leaping higher and higher and casting warmth and radiance. Frank crouched beneath the rocks and warmed himself by the fire. Once in a while he got up and went away to search for more wood to cast on the blaze. Occasionally appeared through the screen of snow in the hopes of seeing some sign of Joe. At intervals he shouted until he was hoarse in the hopes of attracting his brother's attention. The flames leapt up in the wind, and as he piled more wood on the blaze, the fire grew brighter. It was in a sheltered spot where the gusts of snow could not quench the flames. At last he thought he heard a faint shout. Frank sprang to his feet. He gazed through the shifting veils of snow that swirled about his shelter, but he could not see anything. Then he called out, "Joe!" The fire roared, the wind shrieked, snow slashed against the rocks above him. Then out of the inferno of the wind and snow, he heard a shout again, and a moment later he caught sight of a dim figure plunging towards him. He ran forward. It was Joe. He was almost exhausted, and he was blue with cold. He staggered over towards the blaze and collapsed in a heap beside the fire. "Thank goodness I saw the flames," he gasped. "I was almost all in. I couldn't have gone another step. I thought I'd never find you. I hunted all over. I got lost. I couldn't find the trail. We're both lost now. I got off the trail myself when I was looking for you. I don't much care where we are so long as we're together again and we have a fire." Joe extended his trembling hands to the blaze. In a short while he ceased shivering, and as the warmth pervaded his chilled body, his spirits rose. "That fire was a lucky thought," remarked Frank. "I was cold, and it just occurred to me that you might see a fire through the storm, even if you couldn't see me. I just caught a faint glimpse of it, just like a little pink patch shining through the snow. I was just about to give up and lie down on the rocks when I saw it. You'd have died of exposure." For a while the two lads were silent as they thought of how narrowly the blizzard had been cheated of its victim. Then, when Joe had become warmed by the fire, they began to consider their course of action. Frank looked out at the storm. "The wind seems to be dying down a bit," he said. "I could see farther down the mountain now than I could a while ago. Think we ought to start home? Do you feel well enough now?" Joe got to his feet. "Sure, I feel fine. There's no use staying here until nightfall. This storm may last a couple of days." "All right, let's go." They stamped out the fire and resumed their journey down the mountain. They stayed close together this time, taking no chance on again being separated. As Frank had noticed, the wind had indeed lost much of its fury, although it still howled and blustered on the mountain slope. The snow still fell steadily in a drifting cloud, and the trail was almost obscured by the snowdrifts. But Frank was able to find and follow it, and they finally reached the place where they had turned off toward the abandoned mine working several days before. Here they hesitated. "Now that we're so close to the mine, I think we may as well go on with our search." "I was hoping you'd say that. It shouldn't take more than an hour or so, and it isn't dark yet. Besides, we have our flashlights. I haven't mine, but one's enough. Go ahead. It shouldn't be hard to find the lone tree from here." Frank turned off the trail. He headed directly towards the old mine workings they had previously visited, and from which he remembered having seen the lone tree. Snow was deeper than they had expected, and they plowed through drifts up to the waist. They went on, however, and in a short while reached the abandoned mine of their harrowing experience underground. Here they paused. The lone tree was over to the right, I think, said Joe. They peered through the storm. They could see nothing but drifting snow and the dull masses of the rocks. A shift in the wind raised the curtain of storm for a moment, and then, like a gloomy sentinel, they saw the tall pine tree, solitary against the black background of gray. That's it! Now that their goal was definitely in sight, they felt invigorated, and they hastened on through the snow towards the tree with new vitality. Forgetful for the moment that there was weariness and exhaustion, the cold and the snow, in the lure of the goal that they felt sure lay somewhere in the neighborhood of that lonely tree. Stumbling and plunging through the snow, they reached their goal at last. The tree creaked and swayed in the wind, and as they stood beneath it, they saw that they were standing on the verge of a deep pit that seemed to have been scooped out of the earth by giant hands. There were a few ramshackle ruins of old mine buildings nearby. The roofs had long since fallen in, and the buildings sagged drunkenly. At the far side of the bottom of the pit, clearly discernible against the snow, they saw the wide mouth of a cave. That must be the shaft opening, said Frank. We're on the track now. The boys descended into the pit. The going was precarious, for the rocks were slippery, and the snow concealed crevices and holes, so that they were obliged to proceed cautiously. But at length they reached the bottom and made their way across to the mouth of the cave. Frank produced his flashlight as he prepared to enter. Stick close behind, he advised his brother. We don't know what we're liable to run into here. The snow flung itself upon them, and the wind shrieked with renewed fury as they left the unsheltered pit and entered the half-darkness of the cave mouth. It was as though they were entering a new world. They had become so accustomed to the roaring of the gale and the sweep of the storm that the interior of the passage seemed strangely peaceful and still. The flashlight sliced a brilliant gleam of light from the blackness ahead. Step by step they advanced across the hard rock. The dampness and cold became more pronounced. As they went on, the passage widened, and in a few minutes they found themselves in a huge chamber in the earth, a chamber that extended far on into darkness, and they could not see the opposite walls. The curious rustling sound attracted their attention as soon as they entered the place, and Frank stood still. What was that? They remained motionless and silent. Away off in the darkness of this subterranean chamber, they could hear a scuffling and a rustling sounds that the boys judged were caused by pattering feet. Frank directed the beam of the flashlight towards them, but the light fell short and they could see nothing. They advanced several paces. The rustling sounds became multiplied, and then suddenly Frank caught sight of two gleaming pinpoints of light glowing from the blackness. What's that light? Asked Joe. I don't know. I'm going closer. Frank stepped forward again. As he did so, instead of two pinpoints of light, he saw two more, then two more, until at last a dozen of these strange glowing green spots shone from the darkness, reflecting in the glow of their flashlight. Animals, he said quietly to Joe. At the same instant, he heard a low, menacing snarl. The glowering greenish lights began to move rapidly to and fro. Into the radiance of the flashlight shot a lean gray form that disappeared as swiftly as it came. A prolonged and wicked snarl rose from the gloom. Frank glanced to one side and saw that two of the greenish lights had moved until they were circling behind him. He leapt back. We'd better get out of here, he said. Those are wolves. But when the boys turned to retrace their steps, they were confronted by a lean form that barred their way to the cave entrance. And in the glow of the flashlight, they saw two greenish eyes that glowed fiendishly and two rows of sharp white teeth bared in defiance. We'll continue this book next Friday or Saturday. Thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.